I went down a rabbit hole about baking flour and I want to share everything that I learned with you. If you live with endometriosis, it is absolutely important that you watch this video because you've probably been told at some point in your life that you must be gluten free. Hi, my name is Demi. Welcome to the first video in my series, Everything is Trying to Kill Us. And really, this is a series of videos just about what I've said, everything that is trying to kill every person out there who lives with endometriosis. I started this digging into endometriosis as a condition, as someone who suffers from it, and trying to understand the lifestyle factors, be they food, lifestyle, or even environment, that may be driving this disease. I am hoping that this will build a community. So if you are doing research out there and you also want to share, please feel free to post in the comments and expand the knowledge of those of us who are suffering from this condition. Today, I want to talk about food because food is something that I think everyone with endometriosis understands can be an inflammatory point for them. There is no shortage of advice when you live with endometriosis of what type of food to eat and what type to avoid. But is the advice always accurate? One of the things that we've been told we should not eat is gluten. And for a very long time, I lived by that rule. But after I was diagnosed with endometriosis again, and despite my very careful lifestyle in all the other areas, I started to wonder if all of the things that we're following are simply based on people trying to build up this clean lifestyle as opposed to actually what's good for us. But I didn't think much of it until recently. It was a celebratory time and I wanted to bake a pie. So I went to the store and I got a packet of flour. It said enriched flour on it and I didn't think much of it until I got home. And in my head, being someone with a science background, I thought to myself, oh, perhaps we are fortifying flour to address vitamin deficiencies in populations. That has happened a lot and it has helped save many lives, so perhaps that's what it is. As I was about to measure the flour into the bowl to start mixing things up, I turned the packet and looked at the list of ingredients and I was taken aback. The first was it was vitamin E, vitamin A, folic acid, and those were not alarming at all. But the last ingredient was benzoyl peroxide. Now, benzoyl peroxide sounded familiar to me because in my early 20s, I had developed acne and had gone to an esthetician who had had a very scientific discussion with me about how different compounds act on acne. And I remember her mentioning benzoyl peroxide. So I thought to myself, what exactly is that doing here? I did a quick Google search because in my mind I thought perhaps it's a preservative to ensure bacteria does not grow in the flour while it is on the shelf. But I was wrong. First of all, I just said what's benzoyl peroxide used for to verify what I thought I knew about it. And the result was yes, it is used to treat acne. And then I asked, what is it used for in flour? And it said, oh, it's a bleaching agent. And I thought, bleaching? That's interesting. Why would we need to bleach flour? Now, I was born in a part of the world where skin bleaching is very popular. We even have a saying that it is difficult to find a very wealthy man without a light skinned wife. So, a lot of people bleach their skin because, girl, if you're trying to secure the bag, that's probably the best way to get the right attention. So, I thought, are we making flour whiter as well? Because that would be strange. And this whole time, I want to say something that I think reflects what a lot of people think. I have always thought of baking flour as a raw ingredient that is processed, but I have never thought of it as an ultra processed food or something that's been taken through so many steps that it has lost its nutritional value. But that day, I suspended my pie baking and I went down a rabbit hole. I left Google alone and I went straight to the research repositories to dig out what exactly was going on with baking flour and benzoyl peroxide. And what I found was alarming. In the early 1900s, the British imported some of the flour that they used in their country. And because this flour was imported and there was no way to get it from the other countries quickly to Britain, they would sit on the ships. And while they were on the ships, they were exposed to air and they became what we call naturally aged. In other words, the color changed and some of the components in it would break down and it was a little bit finer. Now, flour naturally is not white. It is a yellow product. It has compounds in it called carotenoids, and those are the same compounds you would find in your carrots. So, flour is not white, but when it has been aged naturally, sitting on ships exposed to air, it does become a bit whiter. So these imported bags of flour would arrive at the markets in Britain, and for some reason, just like people seem to prefer those with fairer skin, they also preferred the whiter flour. The whiter flour was also finer. It made cakes that melted in your mouth, and so people just loved it. And I can just imagine being someone who goes into the markets and looking at these two and thinking, this one's a bit yellow. I don't really like it. I like this one because it's white. And because I'm having a tea party, I want everyone to talk about how great my cakes are and how I'm not using this local stuff. I use only imported stuff. I think a lot of us can relate to that because even in this day and age, we tend to have that type of classism around things. Anyway, people started to buy a lot of this imported flour that had been naturally aged. And it created problems for the local mills in Britain because they could not compete. They could not simply take their flour, store it, open it up to air for 6 to 8 weeks so that it could become naturally aged. Because during that time, the imported products would take over their market share. So they started to ask questions around how they can produce the same type of baking flour without waiting 6 to 8 weeks. Enter bleaching. In the early 1900s, two men discovered that they could use chlorine gas or nitrogen peroxide to bleach flour and basically make it whiter. And that way they could compete. So they started to make flour whiter by bleaching it and exposing it to these gases. And for a long time, everyone seemed okay with it. But after a few years, some researchers started to raise alarm, like this man at Cambridge University, who talked about how bleaching baking flour seems to be something we do for the aesthetic appeal and not necessarily for nutritional value. He went on to explain in this paper, a very obscure paper that I found online, that when we bleach flour, we seem to forget or ignore the fact that it strips the flour of all the nutritional content. So it strips it of your vitamin A, vitamin E, folic acid, and in some cases, it might affect the digestibility of the flour. Of course, those who had discovered this process had already registered patents and been making a lot of money from it. So they were coming out against these papers and saying everything is fine, no one is complaining, no one is getting sick. But researchers continued to push and say something is wrong when we bleach flour. And eventually, it was sort of agreed that perhaps we shouldn't use things like nitrogen peroxide. Chlorine gas might be okay, but we can use other products. And that led to a plethora of different compounds used to bleach flour. And some of them include potassium bromate, which you've probably heard about, ADA, which is called azotic carbonamide, chlorine gas, and obviously benzoyl peroxide. Now, when these compounds are used in flour, what they do is they get in there, they break down some of the useful material, they change the color of the flour to make it whiter. But what they also do is they might impact the structure of some of the proteins in the flour, making it difficult to digest. I think you know where I'm going here. That if you've been eating gluten, and thinking every time I eat gluten, I have discomfort and something is just off. Perhaps that's the reason, especially if you're not gluten intolerant. Now, if you're gluten intolerant, that's a whole different issue, and this does not apply to you. But what are the effects of bleached baking flour? Some of the compounds that are used in this process have been linked to liver damage. They have been highlighted to have cytotoxic effects, which basically means they are toxic to your cells, and they are pro inflammatory. Recently, there was a paper that was published that caught my eye. And in it, the authors go really deep on the impacts of bleached flour. For example, they reinforce that indeed bleached flour can cause liver damage. They reinforce its cytotoxic effects, but they also speak to the fact that it does drive inflammation. So when we say that we are going out into the shops and we're buying enriched flour, the reason it has to be enriched is because it does not have the nutrients in it anymore and it is bleached. A lot of people are going out there and buying this flour not knowing that they're buying bleached flour, and they're using it in products and thinking it's a raw material. I'm making my own food at home, but I still have discomfort, so I must have some gluten sensitivity. Now, if you live with endometriosis, you probably know where I'm going with this. Endometriosis is being described these days as an inflammatory condition. And so, to address that, you're often told to eat anti inflammatory so that you don't drive more of the process within your body. But what if the reason you are suffering as someone with endometriosis who eats gluten is because gluten is not the actual problem, but rather gluten has been altered by the bleaching process? And I know this because I eventually started eating gluten again and things changed. And I'm going to share with you in the next video what I mean by that.